It is the belief that eventually the dam will break. The logic goes like this. The baby boomers are the wealthiest generation in human history, hoarding over half of the nation's net worth. They hold the real estate, the stocks, and the pensions. There is a quiet, collective fantasy currently seducing the minds of the millennial generation. It is a grim, unspoken hope, a financial salvation strategy that no one discusses at dinner parties, but everyone calculates in the privacy of their anxious, debt-ridden minds. And since they are mortal, logic dictates that this mountain of capital, often cited as 30 to 80 trillion dollars, must inevitably flow downstream to their children. This is the myth of the great wealth transfer. It is the economic life raft that millions of millennials are clinging to as they drown in a sea of student loans, unaffordable housing, and stagnant wages. They are waiting for the inheritance bailout. But this expectation is not just a miscalculation. It is a statistical lie that is actively seducing a generation into complacency. The reality is that for the vast majority of millennials, there will be no windfall. The money is not coming to you. It is being intercepted. To understand why this inheritance is a mirage, we must first look at the deceptive nature of the aggregate data. When economists proclaim that boomers are sitting on $78 trillion in assets, they are creating an average that masks a terrifying reality of inequality. That wealth is not evenly distributed across the suburban homes of average America. It is aggressively concentrated at the very top. The top 10% of baby boomers hold the vast majority of that wealth. If your parents are not in that top decile, if they are part of the middle class that has been slowly eroding since the 1980s, the assets they appear to have on paper are far more fragile than you realize. The median boomer has significantly less, often just enough to sustain a modest retirement, provided they do not live too long or get too sick. And this brings us to the primary engine of wealth destruction, the longevity economy. The Great Wealth Transfer was a concept theorized decades ago, based on actuarial tables that no longer apply. Boomers are living longer than any previous generation, but they are not necessarily living healthier. We have extended the human lifespan without concurrently extending the health span, creating a window of 10 to 20 years of medical dependency that acts as a vacuum cleaner for generational capital. The American healthcare system, specifically the end-of-life care industry, is designed to absorb exactly the amount of wealth the middle class has accumulated. Consider the mathematics of aging in the modern economy. The average cost of a private room in a nursing home is now exceeding $100,000 per year. In major metropolitan areas, that number can easily double. Assisted living facilities, memory care units for dementia and Alzheimer's patients, and in-home nursing care are not covered by Medicare. Medicare pays for hospitals. It does not pay for long-term custodial care. This is the fine print that destroys the inheritance fantasy. To qualify for Medicaid, the government program that does cover these costs, an individual must essentially impoverish themselves first. This is known as the Medicaid Spend-Down. The system requires your parents to liquidate their savings, sell their stocks, and drain their bank accounts until they have less than $2,000 to their name. Only then does the state step in. That house you grew up in, the one you quietly hoped would be your entry point into the property market or a source of capital to pay off your own mortgage. It is often subject to estate recovery. Even if the house isn't sold immediately, many states have the right to place a lien on the property to recoup the costs of Medicaid care after the parent dies. The family home, the primary vessel of middle-class wealth accumulation for the last century, is effectively repossessed by the healthcare system to pay for the final 3 years of life. Furthermore, we are witnessing a profound psychological shift in the boomer generation itself, a shift from the stewardship mentality of the greatest generation to a consumption mentality. The Depression-era parents of the boomers were obsessive savers who viewed leaving a legacy as a moral imperative. The boomers, culturally conditioned by the consumerism of the post-war boom, view retirement differently. There is a rising trend of spending it all. We see this in the explosion of the luxury travel industry, the RV market, and the second home economy. A popular book title and philosophy circulating among retirees is Die with Zero. The premise is logical from a hedonistic standpoint. Why die with money in the bank when you could have enjoyed it? This creates a dynamic where millennials are not only fighting against the healthcare industry for their parents' wealth, but also against the parents themselves. The ski generation spending the kids' inheritance is not just a bumper sticker. It is a macroeconomic behavior. Reverse mortgages are the financial instrument of this behavior. They allow retirees to tap into their home equity to fund their lifestyle, essentially selling the house back to the bank in slow motion while they still live in it. By the time the funeral happens, the equity is gone, eaten up by interest and payouts. The bank owns the house, not the children. This creates a scenario where the transfer of wealth is not vertical from parent to child, but horizontal. It flows from the accounts of elderly parents into the balance sheets of healthcare conglomerates, pharmaceutical companies, insurance giants, and cruise lines. The money is circulating, certainly, but it is bypassing the millennial generation entirely. The expectation of a bailout is keeping millennials in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a check that has already been spent. They are delaying aggressive savings, delaying risky career moves, and tolerating subpar economic conditions because they have a mental safety net that does not actually exist. The cruelty of this situation is compounded by the fact that millennials are the first generation to arguably need this inheritance to replicate the standard of living of their parents. We are looking at a demographic that has faced two once-in-a-lifetime recessions before the age of 40, a housing market that has outpaced wage growth by staggering margins, and a cost of living crisis that has turned basic milestones like marriage and children into luxury goods. The Great Wealth Transfer was supposed to be the correction, the mechanism that rebalanced the scales. Instead, it is shaping up to be the final rug pull. We are watching the liquidation of the American middle class in real time, disguised as a long retirement. The assets accumulated during the golden age of American capitalism are not being passed down to secure the future of the next generation. They are being harvested to maintain the comfort of the present one and to feed a privatized care infrastructure that has monetized longevity. The anger that is brewing is not just about jealousy. It is about the realization that the social contract of building a better life for your children has been fundamentally rewritten. The ladder has been pulled up and the wood is being burned to keep the warm house warm a little longer, while the children wait outside in the cold, checking their watches, calculating a sum that is rapidly approaching zero. This waiting game is not merely a result of bad luck or poor timing. It is the calculated result of an economic architecture designed 40 years ago. To understand why the wealth is draining away rather than trickling down, we have to stop looking at individual family choices and start looking at the machinery of the system itself. The disappearance of the millennial inheritance is not a glitch. It is a feature of the financialization of the American economy that began in the early 1980s. We must understand that the massive stockpile of boomer wealth, that $78 trillion figure, is largely illusory in nature. It is not piled up in gold bars or cash under mattresses. It is tied up in asset bubbles that were artificially inflated by specific policy choices. The primary vehicle of this inflation is real estate. For the last 4 decades, the United States has treated housing not as a human utility, but as a speculative investment vehicle. The American dream was rebranded. Buying a home was no longer just about having a place to live. It was marketed as the primary way to build wealth. For this model to work, home prices must go up forever, outpacing inflation and wages. This created a perverse incentive for the boomer generation, who became the dominant voting bloc in local and municipal politics. They voted consistently for restrictive zoning laws, NIMBY, not in my backyard policies, and construction bans that artificially strangled the supply of new housing. By preventing new, affordable homes from being built, they guaranteed the scarcity of their own assets, driving their property values into the stratosphere. This is the boomer blockade. The wealth that millennials are hoping to inherit is actually the very weapon that has been bludgeoning them for their entire adult lives. The high rent that prevents a millennial from saving a down payment is the direct revenue stream that funds the boomer's comfortable retirement. The astronomical purchase price of a starter home is the nest egg the parent is counting on. The system was engineered so that the financial security of the parent requires the financial exploitation of the child. It is a cannibalistic economic loop. However, the system has a second layer of extraction, one that is far more predatory than simple intergenerational friction: the rise of private equity. In the last decade, Wall Street realized that the massive demographic shift of aging boomers represented the greatest investment opportunity of the century. They understood long before the average family did that the boomer generation was house rich and cash poor. They had millions in home equity but needed liquid cash for medical bills and lifestyle maintenance. Enter the financial predators. Private equity firms have aggressively moved into the end-of-life industry. They have bought up nursing home chains, hospice care providers, and assisted living facilities at an alarming rate. The business model is ruthless. Acquire the facility, cut staffing levels to the bare legal minimum, sell off the underlying real estate to a separate holding company, and then charge the nursing home and by extension the patient's exorbitant rent. This drives up the cost of care, accelerating the Medicaid spend-down we discussed earlier. Simultaneously, these same financial giants are buying up the single-family homes that boomers are selling or leaving behind. When a boomer passes away or moves into care, increasingly the family home is not sold to a young couple starting out. It is sold to an institutional investor, making an all-cash offer that no individual can compete with. These homes are then converted into permanent rental units. The asset is stripped from the hands of the people and locked into a corporate portfolio. This ensures that the wealth never touches the hands of the millennial heir. It transfers directly from the boomer estate to the shareholder class. The great wealth transfer is happening, but it is transferring from the middle class to the top 1%. We also cannot ignore the devastation wrought by the shift from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution 401(k)s. This was the great risk shift of the late 20th century. Previous generations had guaranteed income for life. Boomers were the experimental generation for the 401(k), told that if they just put money in the stock market, they would all be millionaires. This forced an entire generation to become obsessed with short-term stock market performance. To keep stock prices high and thus keep boomer retirement accounts solvent, corporations engaged in decades of wage suppression, outsourcing, and stock buybacks. Every time a company cut costs by firing workers or stagnating entry-level wages, their stock price went up, and boomer portfolios looked healthier. Millennials entered the workforce right as this logic hit its peak. The stagnating wages of the millennial are the direct fuel for the stock market gains of the boomer. The parents' retirement security was purchased with the children's earning potential. Now, as boomers retire, they must liquidate these assets. But financial markets work on supply and demand. If everyone tries to sell their stocks and bonds at the same time to pay for retirement, prices crash. This is known as the asset meltdown theory. To prevent this, the Federal Reserve and central banks have kept interest rates artificially low for over a decade, until very recently, and printed trillions of dollars. This quantitative easing propped up asset prices, protecting boomer wealth, but it ignited the inflation that is now eating the millennial alive. The cost of living crisis is the collateral damage of a monetary policy designed to protect the solvency of the retiree class. We printed money to ensure the pension funds didn't collapse, but that money chased housing and goods, making life unaffordable for anyone who didn't already own assets. The system is a closed circuit. The tax code further cements this by favoring capital over labor. We tax the sweat of the worker at a higher rate than the passive growth of the asset holder. But even the tax benefits designed for inheritance, like the step-up in basis, are increasingly irrelevant for the middle class because, as we established, the assets are being liquidated before death. The tax loopholes now exist primarily for the ultra-wealthy dynasties, not the average family. So when we look at the mechanism of the economy, we see a machine that was calibrated to extract value from the young and mobile to subsidize the old and static. It encouraged the commodification of shelter, the privatization of care, and the financialization of basic human needs. The boomers didn't necessarily plan this with malice in a smoky back room. They simply responded to the incentives placed before them. They voted for lower taxes and higher home values because it benefited them in the short term. But in doing so, they dismantled the social safety net and replaced it with a personal asset bubble. Now that bubble is springing a leak. The wealth is not being passed down because the system was never designed to preserve it for the next generation. It was designed to consume it. The nest egg was actually a time bomb, and the timer was set to expire exactly when the boomer generation does. The tragedy is that the millennial is standing there, holding the bag, waiting for a payout that has already been earmarked for the medical industrial complex and the private equity landlords. The illusion of the transfer is the only thing keeping the social peace. If millennials understood that the money is already gone, the generational contract wouldn't just be strained. It would be null and void. And once that contract is voided, we are left with the terrifying liberation of the truth. The realization that the cavalry is not coming requires a fundamental psychological and economic reset for the millennial generation. We must collectively undergo a process of grieving for the future we were promised, the future where a single job bought a house, and patience was rewarded with a windfall. That world is dead, buried under debt and actuarial tables. The most dangerous thing a millennial can do in 2025 is to continue planning their life around a lottery ticket that has already been cashed by the healthcare industry. The first step in this adaptation is the radical acceptance of zero-based planning. This is a concept borrowed from corporate accounting, but applied to personal destiny. You must assume with absolute stoicism that your inheritance will be zero. Not a diminished amount, but zero. If any money does trickle down, it should be treated as a miraculous anomaly, not a line item in your retirement plan. This shift is painful, but it is necessary to break the paralysis. As long as you are waiting for the bailout, you are passively accepting your own economic stagnation. By accepting the zero, you regain agency. You stop playing a game that was rigged against you and start playing a different game entirely. This new game requires abandoning the boomer playbook of success. The standard script, go to college, get a stable job, buy a big house, retire at 65, was a product of a specific historical anomaly that will likely never be repeated. For millennials, the stable job has been replaced by the gig economy and precarious contracts. The big house has become a financial albatross. Therefore, the new strategy must prioritize mobility and liquidity over accumulation and heaviness. We are already seeing the early signals of this shift. Millennials are increasingly opting out of the traditional housing market, not just because they are priced out, but because they are realizing that tying their entire net worth to a single, illiquid asset in a fluctuating climate is a risk they cannot afford. We are moving toward a future of asset-light living. This isn't about the romanticized van life of Instagram influencers. It is a defensive economic posture. It involves rejecting the consumerist urge to fill a 3,000 square foot home with depreciating goods. It means investing in skills, digital assets, and diverse income streams rather than physical status symbols. The boomer accumulated stuff. The millennial must accumulate options. Furthermore, the concept of retirement itself must be dismantled. The idea of working for 40 years to spend the last 20 doing nothing was a fabrication of the mid-20th century. For millennials, who will likely live into their 90s but without the pension safety net, the future of work will not be a sprint to a finish line. It will be a marathon of intervals. We will see the rise of micro-retirements, periods of work followed by periods of rest and retraining throughout life. Since the end-of-life pot of gold is gone, the enjoyment of life must be distributed during the working years. We cannot afford to defer gratification until 65, because the data suggests the money won't be there to fund it. However, the most significant shift will not be personal. It will be political. As the great wealth transfer reveals itself to be a lie, the great political realignment will begin. We are approaching a demographic tipping point. Within the next decade, the boomer voting bloc will diminish due to natural mortality, and millennials, along with Gen Z, will become the undisputed dominant political force. A generation that has been systematically shut out of capital ownership will not vote to protect capital in the same way their parents did. When a generation owns nothing, they have no incentive to preserve the status quo. We can predict a massive swing toward aggressive taxation on wealth and inheritance. If the wealth won't transfer voluntarily through families, the millennial electorate will likely use the state to transfer it involuntarily through taxes. We will see a push to close the loopholes that allow private equity to strip-mine nursing homes. We will see demands for universal long-term care, funded by taxing the very assets that boomers are currently hoarding. The politics of the 2030s will be defined by the clawback, an attempt by the younger generations to retroactively fix the rigged economy of the 2020s. But there is a darker timeline we must also consider. If the political system fails to adjust, we may see a profound deepening of the neo-feudalism we are currently drifting toward. In this scenario, society definitively splits into two castes: the inheritors, the top 10% whose parents were wealthy enough to bypass the healthcare drain, and the renters, everyone else. The middle class ceases to exist as a functional category. The renters will live in subscription-based reality, renting their homes from BlackRock, renting their technology from Apple, and renting their mobility from Uber. In this world, the only path to stability is not hard work, but marrying into the inheritor caste. This is a return to the social dynamics of the 19th century, where patrimony determined destiny. To avoid this neo-feudal fate, the millennial response must be collective, not just individual. The realization that hard work, is not enough must transform from a source of depression into a source of solidarity. The quiet quitting phenomenon was the first tremor of this. It was a collective refusal to overproduce for a system that underrewards. The next phase is organization. Tenant unions, debt strikes, and political blocs focused solely on cost of living issues will replace the culture war distractions that currently occupy our screens. Ultimately, the death of the inheritance fantasy is a painful clarifying moment. It forces us to look at our parents not as banks, but as people who are also trapped in a system that monetizes their decline. It forces us to look at our own lives and ask, if no one is coming to save me, how do I want to live? There is a strange kind of freedom in the abyss. When you owe nothing to the past, you are free to invent the future. The boomers built a world of walls, gates, and exclusive clubs. They built a world designed to keep things out. Millennials, stripped of that protection, must build a world designed to let things flow. We will likely be poorer than our parents in terms of dollars and square footage. We will not have the lake house or the gold-plated pension. But we may, out of necessity, build a society that is more resilient, more communal, and less obsessed with the accumulation of dead things. The $30 trillion isn't coming. The check is lost in the mail and the mailbox has been demolished. But you are still here. You are the 0-point generation. And you have everything to gain because you have nothing left to lose. The lie is over. The real work begins now.